Good morning, everyone. Is that on? Yeah. Yep, great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this year's School of Music HDR Symposium. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Mary Broughton, the current HDR Director for the School of Music here at UQ. Before we begin, I think it's important that I acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of our HDR Symposium organisers and attendees, I pay our respects to the ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. We're in for a wonderful day here as part of our symposium, bringing together scholarship and togetherness. Togetherness is something which I think we can probably do with a bit more of after the year we've had. It's been a challenging year in so many different ways for so many different people, but we are getting through together and beginning to return to some kind of normal, and today is a celebration of that. This gathering is an effort to celebrate who we are, that we are here, that we're moving forwards, and how we are exploring and innovating through our research in and around music, our conference theme today. I want to acknowledge and thank our keynote speakers in advance, our staff panel members and performance fellows, and HDR candidates for taking the time to share and be part of the experience today. I want to thank all who are here in the room with us today, as well as elsewhere around Australia, or perhaps the world, for attending, participating, and helping us to build and strengthen our HDR community in the school. So this day would not be possible without your efforts and your contributions. It would also not be possible without the support of our professional staff, especially the wonderful Paul Young, to ensure that we can connect technologically today. I especially want to acknowledge the wonderful work of our symposium co-organisers and HDR student representatives, Eloise Doherty and Nick Hunter. They have done an absolutely fabulous job under very challenging circumstances to bring this event together today for us. Their leadership and their work behind the scenes on this, and also in supporting and working to build our HDR cohort over the last couple of years, has been absolutely superb, and I thank them for that. So with gratitude and appreciation, I'm very happy to open our symposium and to hand over to Eloise and Nick to lead us through today's events.
Thanks very much for that, Mary. First of all, I'd just like to introduce Associate Professor Denis Collins, who will be presenting the first keynote address. He'll be delivering his paper, Explorations Along the Road to Scholarly Survival, a case study of innovation through new tools for old music. If you could all give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Mary. And a very warm and especially grand thank you to the organisers, Eloise and Nick. It's great to be able to come together as a group to share our work, especially after a very difficult and tumultuous year. It's fair to say that many of our research goals for 2020, whether individual or collective, have taken a battering because of the pandemic. time and energies that needed to be diverted to other tasks, lost connections and opportunities, frozen funding, grim employment situations emerging across the tertiary sector. A general sense of malaise and uncertainty persists globally, even with easing of restrictions and hopes for a vaccine that can permit a resumption of what we used to think of as a normal life. Against this tough backdrop, our communities of students and staff have nevertheless managed to advance their research agendas and even to find opportunities for exploring new themes and collaborations. In my presentation this morning, I will take a broad view of the challenges for a music researcher, considering in part ongoing issues throughout the profession and in part using my own work over the last few years as a case study. Although many challenges have been thrown into sharp relief over the last 9 months, certain fundamental features of the research enterprise have retained their currency. In many ways, this is to be expected because of the imperatives of research in any field. These include, most especially, the quest for originality. This often starts as just a mere thread of an idea, but it must eventually find expression according to current notions of innovation in methods and approach. Although most of our participants today are at the early stages of a research career, there are some who have been around long enough to know that it is essential to periodically reinvent, reinvigorate, and re-establish our research credentials if we want to prosper in our professional environment. Institutional contexts form the bulwark of these environments for most of us, certainly those who find employment in universities. The institution comprises many layers, all ideally equipped, we hope, with mechanisms to ensure synchronized understanding of the needs of different communities. These comprise the various cohorts of students, academic staff in fields that may or may not have any communications with each other, and professional and management teams that somehow must keep operational duties and strategic planning on a sensible and financially prudent course. The music researcher needs to communicate with all of these groups. Better still, she or he needs to convince them all about the merits of their research. Very often, the researcher will find sympathetic audiences willing to engage with the perspectives, troubles, and successes. Unfortunately, it is also often the case that a skeptical, indifferent, or even downright hostile reception awaits the researcher. This is something that can be especially daunting to junior colleagues trying to position themselves and their work in a very competitive field. These hurdles are manifest especially in the world of peer review, where anonymity can be mistaken for freedom of belligerent expression by individuals who have built up enough scholarly credibility to be called upon to evaluate the contributions of others. It is vital, therefore, to have a number of strategies to safely and successfully negotiate the ever-changing environments in which we operate. These strategies, of course, need to be flexible enough to be put aside when no longer functional. Along the way, the astute researcher carefully monitors what others have found to be successful, fashionable, or lucrative. I make no pretense about having answers to all of these conundrums, but I can at least point to what has worked successfully in my own experience and what has sadly gone nowhere useful. I would like to point to that most coveted of research awards in our present-day context, the ARC grant. In particular, I can share reflections on what I think helped with arriving to the successful award of my current and sadly soon to expire discovery project. I can also point out pitfalls along the way, including lessons learned from recent and past experiences. Through all of these reflections, my goal is to share experiences and strategies that others, particularly our HDR and early career cohorts, can find useful to consider as they forge their own pathways. This project, details on the slide, covers a chapter in music history that I have long considered fascinating: the near obsession with canonic techniques amongst many composers at the turn of the 17th century, especially those active in Rome. Even though most modern histories of European music pay scant regard to this repertoire, it forms what I consider to be a golden age of canonic composition. European composers had not engaged with canon to such a great extent since the time of Johannes Ockeghem and Josquin des Prez in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. At the turn of the 17th century, Rome was at the centre of artistic and scientific developments in Europe. Revitalized through the sustained efforts of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church, with its centre in Rome, supported a great variety of cultural activities. Many artists and musicians of the time relied upon employment by the Church during some, if not all, of their professional careers. Rome was conspicuous for its lavish patronage of culture, often with colossal results in the arts, architecture, and music. No stranger to controversies, Rome was shaken by the great scientific debates of the age, including the 1633 trial of Galileo for theories of heliocentrism. One of the premises that Jason Stossel and I established for our discovery project is that the resurgence of Canon at centres like Rome shares its motivating forces with early modern scientific thought. In particular, Canonic Repertoire seems to respond to the rise of combinatorics as a tool for the empirical analysis of the natural world. Canon echoes significant changes to European intellectual society. It was a musical manifestation of the mathematization of knowledge of the natural world in writings of authors like Kepler and Galileo, wherein the sensible world is tested by mathematical demonstration and therefore rational induction of natural phenomenon. At this point, I'd like to make a tiny digression with your great indulgence. The title of our project contains the word science, because of the connections that our research wanted to draw between canonic counterpoint and emerging scientific thought. The discovery project round that we entered was particularly brutal. The minister of the time culled 10 humanities projects, including 2 in music, even though they were recommended for funding after the very rigorous peer review process. The minister apparently disliked the types of research suggested by the titles of those unfortunate projects. I have often wondered in the meantime if the word science in our title helped to preserve our project from the dismal fate of the others. The emphasis on science in publicly funded research schemes and the need to make a project look science-y has become even more pronounced over the last year or so, which is a theme that I will return to later this morning. Although many scholars firmly situate the emergence of modern combinatorics alongside Cartesian mechanical philosophy in the second half of the 17th century, there were strong precedents in theoretical writings about music, especially in Athanasius Kircher's Musurgia Universalis concerning automatic music composition. Kircher was one of the great polymaths of all time. In his writings, he tried to provide a synthesis of all known knowledge, something that seems improbably difficult to our modern minds. Kircher drew upon a very large number of other authors, often without acknowledgement, to bring about a theory of musical combinatorics. Foremost among these was Marin Mersenne, whose Harmonie Universelle, 1636, explored combinations and permutations of melodies. On the subject of counterpoint, Kircher reproduced contemporary Italian theories of invertible counterpoint using a numerical matrix, which is reproduced partially in the slide. Kircher also discussed several canons which can be understood to exemplify musical combinatorics. In particular, he referred to a polymorphous canon by the Roman aristocrat and composer Pier Francesco Valentini. Valentini published this canon, called Illos tuus misericordes oculos, in 1629, with a 155-page demonstration of its 2,000 resolutions of the subject in its prime, contramotion, retrograde, and retrograde contramotion. In his preface, Valentini states that his canon invokes the sonorous number object, the true object of musical understanding, at least for the virtuosi in his environment. In setting out almost every possible solution for up to 6 voices in score, Valentini was working in the spirit of early empirical science, providing a demonstration or proof of his subject's near infinite possibilities for combining with itself. Valentini was not using a system of mathematical symbols, geometric diagrams, or the principles of induction, but instead musical notation, scores, and contrapuntal verification. I would like to make clear that I'm not suggesting that canonic musical thought was scientific. Rather, it had embraced mathematical demonstration, resorting to its own system of musical logic, albeit less incontrovertible than the logic of mathematics. By setting out automated composition, composer theorists turned to their own symbolic system for demonstrating that certain combinations of canonic subjects were possible. This symbolic system in musical notation and its graph is the musical score. So far, I've referred to the writings of the great Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher and the canonic demonstrations of Valentini, a member of the Roman aristocracy, who did not need to earn his living through music. What about the canonic activity of composers and musicians active in the city's churches, confraternities, and civic organizations? Documentation of surviving musical sources in musicological research over the last 2 decades indicates a vast effort by composers of the time in canonic counterpoint. As may be expected, canons appear very frequently in music composed for the church, but canonic technique was a mainstay of music pedagogy of the time and appears in dedicated collections aimed at wide audiences. As a case study, I will turn now to the music of Paolo Agustini, not only to show how his music exemplifies the combinative impulse of the period, but to reflect, later in the presentation, on ways to develop publishable research based on this composer using computer-assisted technologies. Agustini worked in several of the main Roman churches and finished his career as Maestro di Cappella at St. Peter's in Rome. He published 6 volumes of music in 1627. These comprise settings of the Mass Ordinary, motets, and short 2-, 3-, and 4-part pieces. Much of the material in these volumes is canonic and reflects Agustini's contemporary reputation as one of the leading contrapuntists of the time. The Masses and motets are amongst the earliest examples of music printed in score format. The short pieces employing canon are mostly presented for one voice only, with signs to assist their resolutions. Many of Agustini's canons are polymorphous canons. This means that there are multiple versions of a work where each version involves alteration to a specific feature or variable. These features may be the interval of imitation, the time distance between the canonic voices, or the use of a technique such as imitation by contrary motion or retrograde. Unlike the polymorphous canons by Valentini, Agustini's canons involve a small number of solutions. To some extent, this limitation may reflect the liturgical context for his music, where considerations of time and effort may have precluded more extensive polymorphic explorations. By way of example, there are 2 closely related versions of the Benedictus from the Messa pro Ferias ad Canones. In one version, the opening canonic voice is followed by 2 other voices, one at the 4th and the other at the octave above. In the second version, the second voice is at the 5th above and the third voice is still at the octave above. The time distances between the first pair of voices is a semibreve in the first version and a breve in the second version, whereas the time distance between the outer voices remains unchanged between versions. In this example, Agustini specifies the addition or replacement of canonic voices to obtain 3 combinations from a canonic melody notated in one part only. 2 of the combinations are for 3 voices, and 1 for all 4 voices, as indicated by the clefs placed at the beginning of the staff in this example. The canonic Agnus Dei section from Agustini's Messa si bone suscepimus can have 14 solutions involving retrograde motion. Agustini adds the comment, various canons of all kind are made for the curious. This signals how Agustini provides demonstrations or proofs of the combinative potentials of his musical materials. That Agustini published all 6 volumes in score format in 1627 points to his choice of this graphical format as a means of verification of his inventiveness with canonic and other contrapuntal techniques. Any part books or choir books for this repertoire are unfortunately lost. Turning away from polymorphous canons to examples using different techniques, page 23 of Agustini's second book from 1627 provides a series of examples of what I'd term multiple technique canon. This is where a single work simultaneously employs 2 or more canonic techniques. For instance, in addition to imitation at a specified interval and time distance, the work may require circular repetitions up or down a whole tone. Other works may be double canons, where each constituent canon involves 2 or more techniques. In contrast to the polymorphous canons, all of the conditions for each canonic technique are combined in just one presentation of a multiple technique canon. The 4 staves at the top left-hand side of the page on the slide comprise the last bars of the Agnus Dei section of Agostini's Missa Ave Regina Caelorum. The rest of this page contains a series of 10 canons in a variety of notational formats, some relatively easy for a modern scholar to resolve, others very difficult, as I can testify. All canons on this page, and the canons elsewhere in this volume, draw on melodic materials that occur at different points in the Missa Ave Regina Caelorum. The canon at the top right-hand of the page is marked A5 Canon del Agnus, is in score format. This is a double canon with a 5th free voice, the topmost notated voice. The double bar lines with dots on either side indicate that this is a circle canon, that is, the music repeats for as many times as the performers wish. Some of the other canons on this page are notated in score format, but many others are not. For instance, on the center left-hand side of this page, there is a canon del Agnus, alio modo, that is presented in score for 4 voices, each on a separate staff. By contrast, on the center right-hand side of the page, each staff contains a separate canon. Here, each canon has its own rubric and the little signs, called signa congruentia, to help the user of the volume to resolve each of the canons. The last canon, located on the bottom right-hand side of the page, is a 6-part double canon and circle canon, notated on a single staff with clefs both right way up and upside down. The solution involves 4 voices singing one of the constituent canons by either similar motion or contrary motion, according to the 4 clefs on the leftmost side of the staff. The other voices sing a unison canon according to the clefs on the right-hand side of the staff. The result overall is a succession of alternating chords based on C and G. Even though Agostini was the leading exponent of canonic composition in early 17th century Rome, no modern edition of his music exists. Long-standing priorities in musicology have involved preserving and making available the rich historical legacy of musical works to modern scholars and performers. Critical editions play a crucial role in this process, permitting detailed assessment of individual composers' stylistic preferences as well as comparative analyses of a range of works across time and place. Modern editions are also essential resources for performers of early music. However, preparing an edition is currently a time-consuming enterprise that relies on manual entry of often very large quantities of musical information derived from close reading of historical sources. In our project, Jason Stossel and I partnered with a computer programmer to build a state-of-the-art machine learning model to encode musical information from the Agostini publications. Our view is that such a model can contribute enormously to efficiency of workflow in a specific musicological project. Our aim is to use the results generated by this model in our preparation of one of the major outputs of our project, a new edition of Agostini's music. For at least 2 decades, there has been ongoing investigation of the use of optical music recognition, OMR technologies, to detect and to classify symbolic music information in digital images of notated music. Only recently have those working in the field begun to confront the challenges of extracting and then encoding symbolic music information from early music sources. With the programmer, we quickly reached the conclusion early on in our project that instead of trying to repurpose older technologies, it would in the end be more efficient to implement our own modern AI-based OMR system. We made very deliberate choices to incorporate industry-standard platforms to automate the encoding of musical information in our system. We have called our system IntelliOMR. In essence, our project focuses on domain-specific use of digital technologies to process digital images for supervised learning using a neural network. This is known as a very basic form of artificial intelligence. So we have, as you can see in the slide, left-hand side, the training set for the system is the Agostini images. We wanted an interactive interface so that we could train the AI tool. And we had 5 phases that I will show in greater detail in following slides. On the right-hand side, then, is just a screenshot of what this, the IntelliOMR system looks on the user's desktop. We devised a system to run convolutional neural networks on a series of 101 high-resolution images of Agostini's printed music. Our system is interactive and operates over 5 phases. We train the system to recognize points of interest as particular musical symbols. This supervised learning involves human users correctly assigning the right symbol to a point of interest, from which the machine begins to assemble what is effectively a database, a little like human memory, that can begin to automatically and correctly assign musical symbols to points of interest. Like all good learning, this involves quite a bit of correction, although we have been amazed by how quickly the system was able to correctly assign musical symbols to parts of scores that did not benefit from any supervised training. The evaluation of the system found 99% accuracy. So of the 5 phases, the first one then is to get the page orientation correct. Otherwise, the remaining parts of the reading won't work. And the little angle-shaped tabs under the words Phase 1 Fixed Page Orientation allow the user to straighten out the page. The next is for the system to recognize page boundaries so that it then can hone in to work within those pages. And if the system fails in any of these, the user can go in and manually correct, and it will learn from that the next time around. Here, it needs to know what's on each staff within the page. And here we get to the stage then where it's ready to make a shot at identifying the notes and other symbols in the image. The way it starts is that the user, first of all, enters the notes using the interface and the little correction buttons, including an eraser, very handy. You save it, it learns, you come back, see what it's done with some unseen music, correct it, repeat the process, and the human intervention becomes less frequent as time goes on. So this is what we end up with. Once we're satisfied that the system has done its job, we export to a score format. How did we do that? Well, we selected the Music Encoding Initiative, MEI, format for outputting Agustini's encoded scores due to strong community support for this open source music encoding project and based upon the benefits for the future extension of IntelliOMR's capabilities. The open source Verovio MEI viewer has also proven to be a useful online tool for verifying encoded notation visually prior to output to file. And it's really great to be able to draw on such a robust resource as Verovio. In the context of our discovery project, OMR tools present an efficient way to transform early 17th century Roman music prints into useful data for further analysis using computers. The same data can be used as the basis of new editions of this neglected repertoire. Traditionally, preparing an edition of music requires many hundreds of hours of diligent human work, transcribing music from a manuscript or early print into music notation software like Sibelius or Finale. The work is painstaking, slow, repetitive, prone to human error, and probably not the best use of an expert researcher's time. OMR, especially the new opportunities described here, addresses these bottlenecks in the editorial and data collecting process. OMR does not replace the editor. There are still errors in scores, like a missing note or misplaced sign, that require critical acumen to solve. However, the delay in arriving at the process of critical editing from the original image of a score is considerably shortened by the new and robust OMR of the kind that we have developed. Our evaluation of IntelliOMR indicates a degree of accuracy that has ensured that we now have in hand highly accurate and automatic MEI encodings of all of Agustini's printed canonic works. These are ready for the task of editorial scrutiny and presentation for publication in a critical edition. And this is one of my big tasks over the summer months. The use of well-supported industry standard platforms and corporate class web services provides us with the confidence that IntelliOMR can be adequately maintained to take advantage of future improvements and efficiencies. Our task was not to reinvent convolutional neural networks or online platforms, but to design an integrated system that made best use of proven and well-documented platforms for creating a unified interface and workflow management tool to recognize and extract symbolic music information from early music prints. Agustini's music scores provided the initial focus and test data to establish this preliminary case for IntelliOMR's effectiveness. In future work, we anticipate that subject to further testing and refinements, IntelliOMR may offer significant advantages for automatically encoding larger corpora of early printed music from the 16th and 17th centuries. Future applications for IntelliOMR may also include handwritten black and white mensural notation from the 14th to 16th centuries. Adaptation of our design to square chant notation of the 13th to 17th centuries may present further opportunities for enhancing the vast collections of images of these sources now available online, including in collections here in Australia at archives and libraries. Since mid-2018, Jason Stossel and I have been workshopping repertoire from our discovery projects with the UQ Chamber Singers. It has been a great pleasure to work with the student members of this group and with their director, Graham Morton. Jason and I have provided contextual backgrounds to each composition, explanations of structural organization and significant features across different works, and approaches to particular issues such as text setting, tuning, melodic inflection, and rhythm. From hearing the group perform this repertoire, Jason and I have been able to make well-informed decisions about certain aspects of the editorial process associated with the outputs from IntelliOMR. These most especially include, for instance, decisions on accidental placements against specific melodic notes, something that was routinely practiced but regrettably underdocumented in early music performance, and very challenging for the modern editor to arrive to any clear decision. The chamber singers have performed canonic repertoire, including parts of the canonic mass from Agustini's first published book, here at UQ, at the State Library, at St. John's Cathedral, and in Toowoomba. On Sunday, March 15th of this year, the singers performed the entire Agustini Mass within a liturgical context at St. John's Cathedral. This, to my knowledge, represented a world premiere performance of this work in modern times. You may recall that UQ instituted a teaching pause the very next day on Monday, March 16th, and we all went into statewide lockdown very shortly afterwards. The choir reconvened only a few weeks ago to finish the recording takes for the Agustini Mass. By way of conclusion, I want to re-emphasize some of the points I made at the outset. First, that it is vital for all of us, whether early career or well-seasoned researchers, to seek out new approaches to what we do, but at the same time to keep track of the fundamental value of originality in our thinking and findings. Originality can be expressed in the well-known avenues towards publication and dissemination, or through novel means that might better pique the interest of our colleagues, institutional peers, external agencies, or broader musically interested communities. I have observed over the last 3 to 4 years how engagement and impact narratives are forming an essential, if somewhat ill-defined, part of the cases we make to various groups. By ill-defined, I have in mind the lack of dedicated budget lines to accommodate these efforts in current grant schemes that I deal with. Showing a connection between historical and theoretical research agendas and national benefit is an ongoing challenge for the part of the music research world that I inhabit. I have pursued several strategies to address this. The use of digital tools can help give the so-called sciencey look that I mentioned earlier, but I have always made sure that the musicological and overall musical results are credible and worthwhile. Finding new connections for performance of works that I study has been invaluable and has led to strong engagement narratives. Above all, my advice for my audience today, whether in person or online, is to keep a flexible working strategy in place for the maturation and dissemination of your research, no matter what temporary setbacks you experience along the way. Don't be afraid to ask colleagues for advice and perspectives. You will mostly find that even the most hardened of researchers will be gratified to be asked. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that rich presentation, Denis. We'll turn to the questions that people have. I do have one question to start off with. So the program that you're talking about is dealing mostly with the notational aspect
So I'll repeat that question for people. Yeah. So Nick is asking me, great that we've investigated the various notational aspects of this music through various project means. But then, if I understand correctly, you're asking, Nick, can a computer then take a piece of music and realize the polymorphic potential within it? Yeah, give me money and I'll tell you. So that's a harder ask, but we have the raw data in place. We have the symbolically encoded musical information. We have good ideas on the types of tasks and programs to run on this information to get those types of results. We have other priorities along these lines, and in fact, this type of computer-assisted musical analysis is one of the major components of this and the previous grant. So we're looking at contrapuntal grammars, looking at specific recurrences of melodic and harmonic intervallic patterns across canonic writing to help us label the geography of that technique across time and place. To take it along further directions to arrive at an instant realization of the combinative potential of a given melody. Yes, that's a logical extension, but we have to complete the other steps first so that the computer knows what would be, say, typical patterns associated with the contrapuntal grammar of a particular period for that matter. So yes, with that was on our mind, and it's one of the goals, long-term goals for the project. But you know, due to the limitations of a project like this, we had to make very clear decisions on where we wanted to focus the effort. And we reckoned that to first of all encode the music of Agustini, the most representative composer of Canon at his time, and then to prepare a modern edition, which is one of the bulwarks of early music research, and then to conduct analysis of the repertoire using tools that I've developed according to my typology of canonic technique, plus these other computer-assisted means as well.
Thanks, Denis, for that fascinating presentation. It's really groundbreaking work there. Just, you know, what makes me wonder though is, I suppose it's a sort of a similar question to Nick's, and I suppose the answer in short will be similar. And that is, do you ever foresee, I mean, thinking about the time period between, let's say, when OMR for music first appeared and it was terrible, and now, and let's say that's about 20 years or so, do you ever see a point in the future where a system like that would be capable of dealing with the manuscript?
Okay, so Simon's question is building on Nick's, and he's asking, will OMR get to the stage where it can deal with music manuscripts? Is that correct, Simon?
That's correct.
Yeah, look, there are projects out there exactly doing this type of work with manuscripts. There has been some great work on lute repertoire, for example, from the 15th century. But dealing with handwritten sources is much, much more difficult than dealing with prints. Much, much more challenging. We're hoping that our system can evolve, can be developed to actually deal with certain types of handwritten repertoires along the way. The crucial point I'd like to make in relation to that, if you have ambitions to tackle heavy, hard, difficult source materials, you need to have a system like our system plugged in to industry standard, reliable, community-supported software packages and coding platforms. Otherwise, this would just disappear next year, when we move on to something else. So, to really answer Simon's question, you need a robust system that is on top of all developments, but has a dedicated team who can apply the results, not in some idiosyncratic and purely local project development, but one that is part of an international, more broadly focused effort. So yes, that work has started in manuscripts. We'd love to do a little bit, but we are right now in the context of this project dealing almost entirely with print sources. The Valentini, however, that Roman gentleman, he left some manuscripts, but they contain a lot of artworks. So we are hoping that in view of perhaps future funding success, we could develop IntelliOMR to look at certain types of manuscripts. We have in mind the religious, the chant-based sources that are here in several Australian libraries, and those involve artworks as well as music within them. So we'd like to extend the system to recognize and codify direct users interactively to art historical features as well as musical features of manuscripts. Relevant to this project as well because, as you saw in some of the slides, the visual component of Canon was highly relevant and symbolic. I think that's all I wanted to say about that sound.
Thank you, Denis. That's a wonderful talk. And one aspect of the tools and the resources you're developing is to make them available worldwide. Can you talk a little bit about are they being taken up and
Yeah, that's a great question. So the philosophy in this corner of the world, amongst the guys who love computer stuff and go for innovation in new coding platforms and applications and avenues of research, is to share. Make it available so others can take it up and go play with it. We have done that. It's the repository is GitHub. So people can go there to have a look at the code that we've developed. It is curated. We can't really let anybody jump in and mess around because they could destroy what has a certain degree of frailty because there's only a small number of us to take custodianship of it. So yes, interested parties can approach us and by all means access the two storage points. One is the programmer's world where he developed this system on a training set. The other area, and this is where things get really, really hard for historical musicologists, is the training set. What about someone who wants to play around with our training set to see if they can get similar results? Well, our training set is based on materials kindly provided by libraries, so there are copyright issues and restrictions. We cannot simply open up to the world the materials that we used for our studies in agreement with those institutions. It cannot be just sent out willy-nilly to anybody. It needs to be very carefully curated. And I have to say there is no easy solution to this because the field is so rapidly moving and evolving. The holders of these images and primary resources haven't yet adjusted their thinking to the way in which their materials could end up being used through the types of research, including what we are doing. So it's really fraught, and it's a conundrum at present. There is an element of risk. Jason and I cannot afford to alienate, offend, or antagonize any of the libraries where we do a lot of our research. We want very firm, solid, warm, friendly, productive relationships with those people. And because of the COVID restrictions on travel, we haven't been able to be there in person and say hello to these guys. It'd be much easier as part of our regular travels to the archives to set up an appointment, talk to the person who is relevant authority and say, look, this is what we were doing. Can you give us some pointers about your expectations and what you'd like us to observe and what we should or should not do? It's much easier to do it in person, much more friendly, than to try and set it up over email. So we're gathering our energies, waiting for the travel to resume and then come to resolution. We have spoken to the copyright librarian here, who was very helpful and agreed with us that we need to proceed with extreme caution. But for the techie stuff, it's fine. People can come in and have a look at the types of coding and all the rest of it, and that's part of the philosophy. You probably know, anybody who's been following the world of programming over the last generation or so knows that it's a very altruistic world. People like to share, make freeware, send stuff around, put it on GitHub, anyone can go and have a look. It's all very collegial. It's not quite tuned into the world of commercialization. That is something that might raise the heckles of people who are rather free-spirited in terms of the aims of research. So I haven't touched on that. We like to think that we're doing a great service to our community of like-minded scholars and anybody else coming up the ranks as early career researchers. Okay. Yes, Eloise.
What we can see coming through in your research is a very big emphasis on cross-disciplinary work. So bringing musicology into computer programming, linking things together. And it's evident that that's becoming more and more crucial. in the world of academia to be able to forge a career in research and academia. Do you have any strategies for managing the expectations of having multiple areas of expertise? Is there a limit? And if so, how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's tricky because
Could you just repeat the question?
yeah, the question is managing interdisciplinary research teams. All to the good, highly recommended, lots of eulogies in support of that. So there is an expectation that we do talk to our peers across different disciplines, but the trouble is when push comes to shove, when evaluation committees sit down to look at it, they often give it a hard time. So that's one thing. The second thing is that when you draw people together from different backgrounds, you need to make sure that everybody understands why they're in the same Zoom call or the same room. And for us, that the musicological message is clear. We're doing it because we want to get this result. For this project, the first result is the Agustini edition. Next result will be the analytical investigations of the repertoire, and so on and so forth. There are lots of things I just don't have the ability or the time or the commitment to learn. Having a programmer, PhD in computer science from UQ, 20 years experience in the industry, having a programmer come in and look at the problems we were presenting. How can we do this? We've looked at what people are doing in our part of the musicological world, the digital musicological world, and we see issues. Programmer went away, had a thing, came up with these fantastic solutions that really simplified the process and helped build this original system within budget. Now, when I started out as an ECR, interdisciplinarity meant music talking to other humanities, essentially. There's still a residue of that worldwide. To me, to be cross-disciplinary means talking to people in the sciences as much as humanities or social sciences or the health sciences. So we need, I think, for everyone to have a good sense that you can be talking to anybody. It can be a very strange match on the surface, but if you have a goal in mind, then you should be able to present a good case.
I was wondering which coding language the program used to create your software.
He used a lot of Java and he used Python as well. He was not. We had some legacy software in C++. He, being I suppose a man of the times, didn't engage much with that language, even though when I was learning programming, that was the standard, the most excellent around, very robust as well. And also, just to add, the Amazon Web Services provides excellent resources for managing a project like this. It's very cheap, and it's reasonably safe and not likely to keel over next year or next week.
So I just had a musicological question as well too. With what you were saying about like the mathematical demonstration and the classification of all the different combinations of Canon, just maybe if you could speak a bit more about how that related to the broader trends of classification in the period, whether that was in music influenced by other types of sciences at the time.
Okay, look, we could have an entire conference on that. Nick is asking about the broader classifications of knowledge in relation to mathematics and other directions, I suppose from the perspective of music history in the early 17th century. Look, most of the research has been done on combinatorics and mathematics from the later 17th century. But we believe that the grounds, the early seeds of this emerging, what we call, we used to be called a scientific revolution, but now it's called emerging scientific thought, happened much earlier. And because music was part of the quadrivium, it sat along the hard sciences, arithmetic, geometry and astronomy, and music was there. So it had a long tradition of being discussed and thought about mathematically. That persisted through the university system and in much of the writings about music. In the 16th century, things started to change. A greater sense of aesthetic perspective emerged. And then in the 17th century, that was taken further, so that music's relationship to maths and science was greatly weakened by the time we get to the end of the 17th century. And then, of course, when we get into later times, everything radically shifts. So it's part of the reason why we're here in a humanities and social sciences faculty rather than a science faculty, where we would have been, I suppose, at the time of this project. Is there anything more specific you'd like me to talk about, Nick?
No, as I said, like the entire conference just on the subject of it. So, and I guess.
Okay, just make one final comment on that. At the turn of the 17th century, every scientist worth their salt was grounded in music, either a performing musician and or a music theorist. Galileo's father was a music theorist, a lutenist, Vincenzo. Kepler was absolutely obsessed with music. His great scientific discoveries along the way didn't prevent him from coming back again and again to music theory and his what now looked like preposterous and insane theories of the universe based on harmonic ratios. Johannes Clavius, Newton was also, likewise later on, in later times, totally obsessed. So and Descartes, his first little book when he was 18 was on music. Very mathematically oriented little tome, but has some aesthetic nuggets in it. So that's just a little postscript link to your question. Anything else before we wrap up?
Could you please talk a little bit about the process of, I guess, generating an idea of we would like to do this and here's how we can do it, like how the beginnings of this project and how things came together?
Okay, so Eloise's question is, what did you do at the very beginning? You had these various ideas, you had some goals. How did it all kind of morph together to make some sort of good direction? Yeah, well, one of the steps along the way was to review existing closely related technology and to see if we could build upon those, perhaps extend them, perhaps get into collaborative agreements with other people. But our programmer took a hard look and said no. The reason is when he tried to look at the code, it didn't make sense because it wasn't very well documented. If you're a programmer, or, you go online and ask a question to the community of users of that tool. They often don't exist for some of these other packages in music. So it just became clearer to us that we would have to devise our own tool, but as part of that process to use industry-wide standards, the tools of the computational trade. And I think I alluded earlier in the question time to the fragility of a project like this, and that ties in exactly with your question, Eloise. You need to make sure that as you're starting this project off, that you have a clear pathway to its what the computer science people call the robustness of the project and its portability, its use by others over a longer period. And then there's the thorny question of funding. How do you pay to keep it going? But luckily the charges turn out not to be so high, actually, so we're not running into problems there.
Thanks very much. Of this symposium. And then we'll also be hearing from recent graduate Dr. Paul Ballam Cross. So let's welcome both of them.
Hello everyone. My name is Eloise Doherty and I'm a PhD student here in the UQ School of Music. I'm both a musician and an audiologist, so my research seeks to combine these two areas of expertise by approaching one area of study from two different angles. Firstly, I sought to understand how children who have hearing loss and wear hearing aids learn and progress in group flute lessons compared to their typically hearing peers. Secondly, I mapped the effect that these flute lessons had on the children's auditory processing abilities. So I wanted to see if that sustained and active engagement with sound helped their brains to process auditory information more efficiently. This was a mixed methods project which sought to both quantify outcomes and understand the human experiences behind those outcomes. All in all, my PhD project was actually quite traditional. I collected a variety of quantitative and qualitative data, and I did conduct, generally, the expected analyses on them. But we only have 15 minutes today, and that data and those analyses form stories for a different time and place. You see, there are many ways of telling, understanding, knowing, and exploring. Truth and validity are in the eye of the beholder, because, as Richardson puts it, what we see depends upon our angle of repose. Even in positivist research, which actively seeks to remove the uniqueness of both participants and researchers, there are always human stories and experiences behind the numbers. These don't just disappear from existence as we attempt to strip away the humanity and catalogue the remnants into our research papers. Instead, they're swept behind the veils of scientific convention, obscured in the homogenized, omniscient voices that we are so used to reading in scientific journals. Today, I seek to lift that veil and explore the human elements behind the numbers. Yes, you're going to hear about some musical outcomes and the experiences of researcher, teacher, and student. But this presentation is different. Because it's actually not about clear data and clear answers. This is a storied approach. It's open to interpretation and exploration, and as such is coloured by your own knowledge, experiences, and views of the world. This approach seeks to make you think, and in doing so, may leave you with as many questions as it does insights. To paraphrase Richardson, today you will know more, but paradoxically, you may also doubt what you know. Explorers in a pirate's cave know not what they'll find. There may be buried treasure or traps of any kind. Be careful where you step, for who knows what may lie ahead. The murky depths hold riddles to be found and carefully read. And maybe we won't make it back to here when we embark. But either way, some knowledge waits in the light beyond the dark. And it was really with this sentiment that the adventure began. Now, this adventure was, of course, my PhD project, which sought to understand how children with hearing loss learnt and progressed in flute lessons, while simultaneously assessing whether that musical engagement had an effect on their auditory processing skills. It was a journey that required me to step through many dimensions, shape-shifting as I went. Audiologist, positivist, analyst, musician, teacher, observer, advocate, thinker, writer. And because of these changes, from planning to implementation to writing, Act 3 has proven to be the most challenging of all, because I've now come to know each of the three selves who walked this research journey. In this Act 3 phase, the selves of Acts 1 and 2 are still there, but it's Act 3, the self of Act 3, who ties them together. But this presentation isn't really about me. It is about the 8 children who walked Act 2 with me. In some ways, it's also about their parents. You see, I taught these children for an entire school year. I got to know them, I got to know their families. I saw their effort, commitment, and unique qualities. And along with that came a weighty realization. These families trusted me with their stories. Yes, they also trusted me to find a balance between my researcher persona and my teacher persona. They trusted my ability to teach their children well, to be a good researcher, and to act ethically. But their stories were the most precious of all, because their stories were to be immortalised in the pages of my thesis. Here we see it, opalescent, shining in the dark, a mermaid's treasure from the depths, pale but never stark. Glowing soft, I see the sun of ancient times gone by, not mineral, but honey spun with secrets locked inside. Vibrant purple, close to clear and mixing in between, I see the bright and sparkling gem, prized by kings and queens. Next, I see the deepest red, gleaming in the light. It brightens as I move ahead to better see the sight. The sparkle of a clear, bright night is beautiful indeed, and here it is, inside a stone, vivid, strong, and free. Now I spy the brightest green, forged in rock and fire, its joyful, energetic sheen since ancient times admired. Water of the tropics now, pale blue and clear, I see a wise and gentle stone, honest and sincere. Gallant, bright, and shining smooth like vibrant drops of light, this element adapts and moulds, but strong in its own right. Each treasure has a tale to tell, special and unique. They weave together in this chest. They emanate mystique. Description lies ahead for you, but first, who could these be? Read again and close your eyes. What is it that you see? This? Perhaps. But I also see the children, because when it came to introducing them, this ended up being what felt right. By the time I started writing, my initial plan of publishing 8 neat little case studies was starting to feel cold, clinical, and distant. It seemed to diminish the children's efforts and uniqueness, reducing them to codes for sorting and numbers on a page. Nothing beautiful, nothing unique, and certainly a poor thanks for their investment. I was also struggling with de-identification because the process of assigning pseudonyms suddenly felt so very wrong. These children all have names, their own names, the names that their parents gave to them, and taking those away seemed like just another step in the reduction of their humanity. At the same time though, if I aimed to celebrate their uniqueness, de-identification really needed to be done, and done well. To me, wrapping them up in the symbolism of wondrous treasures seemed appropriate. So today, by way of illustration, I'll introduce you to Peridot. Peridots are volcanic gems found in lava flows and other types of previously molten rock. They form in the heat and pressure of the Earth's mantle before being pushed towards the surface by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. In this regard, they're gems of activity and energy. Peridot has a long history as a prized gemstone, with records showing that it was once mined by the ancient Egyptians. It can be found with a brown or yellow tint, but is most valued when it occurs as a bright, vibrant green. However, despite its dramatic origins, Peridot is not the hardest of the gemstones. It's certainly resilient, but it's also more prone to scratching than other coloured gems. It was the energy, the bright, joyful colour, and the ancient soul of Peridot that led me to hide this treasure's identity behind its shining guise. The Peridot, frozen here in time, was an active, enthusiastic student who loved horse riding, participated in a large variety of extracurricular activities, and who, prior to starting flute lessons, had also been participating in piano lessons for a year. Peridot was a busy student, and in her lessons, she was consistently excited and engaged. She seemed to love the process of learning and found satisfaction in doing things well. She was quick to get a sound on the head joint of her flute, achieving this within her first lesson, and she learnt her first few notes easily. Although Peridot initially found it difficult to maintain a sound when using the whole flute, that really only lasted a few weeks, and soon she was playing her first pieces confidently and fluently. Although she consistently played an octave and sometimes even 2 harmonics higher than written, this improved over time as she refined her skills. It was evident, even in those very early stages, that she was able to take instruction very well. In the first half of the year, Peridot proved to be a very capable student, but she was also very interesting in the way she learnt. She was often extremely excited in her flute lessons, almost to the point of hyperactivity. Yet she learnt fast and understood new concepts easily, even if I wasn't sure that she was entirely listening during some explanations. It really helped that she was motivated to progress, and she could make herself stop and focus when she needed to. At the time, I wondered if Peridot just loved the process of discovery so much that she couldn't contain her excitement. As she matured over the year, Peridot's boundless energy settled, but she was still involved and engaged. Her progress did start to slow a little bit as she started to contend with increasingly complex repertoire and sheer exhaustion towards the end of the school year. But these challenges then showed one of her other strengths. Peridot is incredibly resilient. There were times in her lessons when she was obviously frustrated, unable to achieve the standard that she set for herself. Sometimes she would become disheartened when things weren't working properly, but she always kept trying. Often, Peridot put more pressure on herself than anyone else. She held herself to a high standard and always tried to do things well. Like her gemstone, Peridot was a bright and vibrant student. Although her shine could occasionally be dulled by tiredness or frustration, it was also evident that she was mature for her age and overwhelmingly resilient. She clearly loved music and was always motivated to do her best. So now that you've met her, I'm going to tell you that only half of the children in this project had hearing loss, because in mixed methods, control groups are important. Was Peridot one of them? Well, let's have a listen to her play. So what do you think now? Well, now that you've met Peridot for who she was rather than her hearing status, I'll tell you that she does have hearing loss in both ears. She's worn hearing aids since birth, but this particular year they failed many times. This made things harder for Peridot and was often a significant source of frustration for her. But her determination prevailed, and through that, she demonstrated an important point. Hearing is one thing, but listening is everything. And just before we finish, I'd like to say thank you. Research like this isn't possible without the generous funding we've received, so a very special thanks goes to Hear and Say for providing me with both teaching and clinic space for the duration of this research project. I also would like to thank the Australian Government for the support they've provided through a research training program scholarship. I also need to acknowledge my advisors, Professor Margaret Barrett and Associate Professor Wayne Wilson, for their support and encouragement throughout this process. I think they'll both agree that it's been quite a journey. Most crucially though, I would like to thank the children and their parents for the huge amount of time and effort that they put into flute lessons and data collection in 2018. I'm so proud of all of them. It was a joy to teach them, and research like this certainly would not have been possible without their input. Thank you. Okay, any questions?
Thanks very much, Eloise, for that very interesting presentation. I just had a question about your narrative. So in the sort of the writing up process, when you get selected about the aspects of the stories that you want to include, how do you make sure that you include stuff that is contributing or explaining the broader theme of what you're trying to discuss in your research?
So Nick's asking about this process of writing the narratives and making sure that in choosing what to present and how to present it, that the required information is included to address the topic of the research. Is that pretty much?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I understood it correctly, it seemed like you sort of tied it together at the end by saying, understand these things about the person so that they're not only seeing someone who's hearing loss, but obviously they have a lot of parts to their life, so
Yeah.
how are you selecting what you choose to include?
Okay, yeah, and the extension of that then is how to choose when to present hearing loss or not, and how to do that. That was definitely quite a long process in terms of the narrative component and the fact that I really had to describe these children and their journeys and things. There's a really delicate balance as a researcher to put in the information that needs to go in there, and to make sure that you're not holding back on important information, but to do it in a way that's really respectful. So respectful to the families and to the children. It's an ethical requirement to remember that these children will grow up. If one of these children picks up my thesis in 10 years and reads it, how will they perceive the information that's in it? I need to think about that now because it's going to be there forever. Yet you don't want to be hiding elements as well. Hiding things that maybe didn't go so well or didn't quite go to plan. And there is a principle, and I can't remember who says it, but there is a post-qualitative researcher who basically just says, aim to write with kindness. So things may not necessarily be perfect, but you just have to be very kind in the way you write and the way you approach it. Part of the reason, so that's sort of how I've been picking through, it's making sure that everything is there. It's a detailed description of each child and their journey. And there are lots of other elements that come into it as well. These are just the way that these children were introduced initially. We then build on that with a lot more information and a lot more data. We look at them as groups as well as individuals and things like that. So that also helps with that process of showing depth, that this is really just the beginning. In terms of deciding to withhold the hearing loss or normal hearing information, that very much came down to the fact that these children are so much more than that one trait that they have. These children are, they're in mainstream schools, they hear, they listen, they speak. As far as they're concerned, they wear hearing aids and that's it. There's nothing particularly unusual about that for them. And given the technology that we have these days, and the way that we can help to manage hearing loss for most children, that's great. That's actually what we're aiming for. We want them to be able to do anything that any other child can do. And it's a long process, and in Australia it's definitely been a process that's in Queensland been underway since about 2004, and is finally gaining a lot of traction now in that we can pick them up for most of them at birth and then get the hearing aids on and start intense therapy to help them progress and maintain their normal developmental milestones for speech and language. So it was a very conscious decision that these children shouldn't, and their achievements shouldn't be defined by their hearing loss. The last thing that we wanted from this was for someone to listen to her recording and go, oh, not bad for a child with hearing loss. Because in this context, that's actually not relevant. Really, she achieved it, when we looked at the statistics, she achieved at the same level as the children with typical hearing, which is great. That was an outcome that we hope to see, but you never know what you're going to get when you step into a classroom, because every child is different. So we didn't want to make that obvious very early. The information is important, the information needs to be there, but it's about finding the right way to do it. The advantage for me was having a more narrative structure to this. I could employ narrative techniques. And so the one that I used was that of the unreliable narrator, where I only tell part of the story, or I lead the audience down one path and then spring something on them at the end. And so in the thesis, that's actually what happens, where all of the children are described with absolutely no reference to hearing or hearing loss. And then at the end, it's not till the end that we have almost, it's not who am I, but it's almost presented like that, where I then explain which children did have hearing loss, and I link the context of that back into their stories to explain how that fits together. Did that kind of cover it?
Yeah, I guess then, the crux of your research then would be to demonstrate that there's arguably no real difference between students that had the hearing loss and those that didn't, in terms of their quality of life and things like that.
Yeah, so Nick just said, I guess the crux is that there's really not much difference between the children with hearing loss and those with normal hearing. Which is true in terms of their ability to engage with that musical training. Yes, their ability to engage and progress, not huge differences. But actually what did show up was that, just like in any other classroom setting, every child has their unique skill set and unique qualities. Every child learns differently, regardless of hearing loss. They can have completely typical hearing. Every child is still going to learn slightly differently and have their own idiosyncrasies and their own strengths and weaknesses. So working to that was important, but actually I found that I didn't make any extra adjustments for the children with hearing loss. That was pretty well the same. What is intriguing when we started looking at them as groups, because I taught them in groups of 4. So we had one group with hearing loss and one group with typical hearing. And the interesting thing that came through from those patterns of what actually happened in the lessons was that the group with hearing loss functioned as a whole very differently in lessons. And we can't say exactly why. I can suspect that that's been a hallmark of their early training. But that group with hearing loss came into their lessons and they were focused, they worked hard, they were really willing to help each other, they were very cohesive as a group, even though they hadn't actually met each other prior to starting in this study. The group with typical hearing, they were still great to teach. They were a bit noisier, they had a lot more scope for mischief. So I found I had to work a bit harder as a teacher with them to keep the lessons on track and on time. And one of the theories that we've got behind that is that the children with typical hearing had a little bit more scope for mischief because they didn't have to work as hard to hear what was going on around them. Number one, hearing aids are good, but we can't replace normal hearing yet. But then the other part of it is the environment. I taught out of Hear and Say, which is the centre where these children have their auditory verbal therapy, and they have that from a very, very young age. So the mindset, because for them that's hard work, we're teaching them to listen and to hear and to speak. So the mindset for them when they set foot in that building is, I'm here to work. So there were some differences in the groups as wholes, but probably more related to the cultural aspects of where they were. The typically hearing children stepped into that environment with no preconceived notions of what that environment meant. So yeah, that was an interesting difference that came through. Brilliant, thank you very much.
Okay, so I just want to give a brief little bit of exciting good news that I just received just this morning. I had an email, and I'm going to be talking about this exact topic, potentially a revised version at the ISPM conference in South Korea in 2021. Probably not actually going to go there, probably just going to do it via Zoom, but still very, very exciting. So this is going to come back again. So let's get started. So we're talking about re-equalized pop songs that you're playing on cultural nostalgia, an examination of YouTube popular music and memory. I've been doing a lot of research on popular music and nostalgia recently. I spoke at a conference last year about the Australian band King Gizzard, who have done a little bit of playing around with the ideas behind nostalgia. I've also been looking at various electronic music genres of the 2010s, like chillwave, synthwave, and vaporwave, all of which focus on invoking music and memory of the past, usually involving key cultural icons from the 1980s or 1990s. The researchers Bourne and Howarth have termed these genres, among many other online genres, the nostalgia genre continuum, which is a great name. So these genres rely on an unusual form of nostalgia that involves generating memories or feelings from a mixture of shared cultural touchstones, rather than from the listener's actual experiences. I've discussed this in more detail in another article, Reconstructed Nostalgia, Aesthetic Commonalities in Chillwave, Synthwave, and Vaporwave, which is being published early next year. So today what I'm discussing is a subgenre of YouTube videos which relates to these genres, and particularly Vaporwave. This style of YouTube upload, which I wish we could have heard earlier, but clearly my PowerPoint skills aren't that great, involves users creating re-equalized, modified versions of popular songs, designed to make the listener react in certain ways. They're definitely a very, very niche product, but they engage in exactly the same kind of cultural re-examination of nostalgia as these other genres. So I'm going to propose a genre name for these. I'm going to refer to these as filter wave. This name highlights that these songs are filtered both in a really, really literal sense, users running these very familiar pop hits like Toto's Africa through equalization or filters to create a new version of these songs, but they're also being filtered through a layer of your own memories and your own experiences. In the upcoming article that I mentioned before, I've discussed the idea of this reconstructed nostalgia. Although there's been some similar terms that researchers have used before, this term that I'm using, reconstructed nostalgia, is really useful in regards to this music because it highlights the cultural references and the way that these are transformed and changed. By using familiar cultural imagery, these uploads evoke nostalgic feelings or memories, but these do tend to be pretty unrealistic. They tend to rely on your imagination and your memories more so than having anything to do with reality. Usually, musical nostalgia involves personally salient music. music that we recognize, that we enjoy, and so it's unlikely that autobiographical memories are evoked by unfamiliar music, normally. Nostalgia's impact usually depends on a person's relationship to a given song, usually expressed as how familiar they are with it and how it's associated with a personal memory. However, in this music on the nostalgia genre continuum, this is reversed. In these genres, the specific personal nostalgia becomes merged into a past which the listener knows and accepts never existed. The researchers Winston and Saywood have been doing some similar research on the YouTube lo-fi hip-hop community, and they point out that similarly, a major element of that genre involves hyper-specific memories of popular media. Pick your TV show from the 1980s and the 1990s, and there'll be a reference to it. But equally, a vague, abstract longing for a past which the listener is fully aware never existed. YouTube users respond to this with short fictional narratives, which Winston and Saywood describe as narrative microfiction. They suggest that this is a kind of playing along, a suspension of disbelief. These users create and post brief fictional fragments, and which is also echoed across chillwave, synthwave, and vaporwave, but also in filterwave. So let's talk a little bit about these videos, which again would have been a little easier if I'd managed to make that link work, but never mind. So some trademarks involve there's three core elements that we're going to see again and again and again. So there's the use of popular music, usually very familiar, obvious hits. A similar title every time implying an action or a location, and re-equalization of the original song. So songs vary widely in genre, tempo, and mood, but are usually pretty popular across genres and listener base. For example, we had before Toto's Africa playing in an empty shopping centre. That has more than 3.5 million views. Uploads which perform most will tend to be those involving the popular music of the 1970s and the 1980s. It's the nostalgic value and the shared cultural memory of this that's really prized. Some uploads use wordplay based on the song chosen. Take Me to Church by Hosier, but you're outside of church on a rainy day about to confess yourself. Or involve dark humour. Talking Heads, Psycho Killer, playing while you hide in a not quite empty shopping centre. Others are even more over-the-top specific. Hey There Delilah, but it's played in an empty Toys R Us at 2:37 p.m. with moderate traffic outside. We'll come back to that one a little later. The reason for the specificity of these titles is twofold. They're played both for humour, as well as to ground the listener within the fictional scenario suggested by the uploader. With the specificity of these titles, there's absolutely no doubt about the imagery that the uploader intends the listener to think of. So there's only a few variations on the titles of these filterwave uploads. The vast majority follow the meme-like pattern of title of the song and artist, but you're performing an action or in a location. There's sometimes title of the song and artist playing in a specific situation as well, very similar. The situations given in the titles of these uploads tend to also be only one of a few different variations, perhaps because of limitations of user ability in re-equalizing these songs. Almost all uploads involve the song playing either in an empty mall, a school, a bathroom, or from another room. These are very, very broadly divided into one of two styles, which I have referred to as meme style and vaporwave style. So Schiffman has argued that the two central elements in internet memes and YouTube memes are the use of simulacra and pastiche, and the reworking of texts, both of which could be attributed to either of these styles. Very, very broadly and very quickly summarized, the meme style uploads use the song title but your action format primarily for humor or shock value, and generally use very contemporary popular music, whereas the vaporwave style uploads use the same format to engage with listeners' nostalgia much more so, and generally use music from the 70s or 80s. A key difference is the final effect of the upload. Vaporwave style uploads tend to involve much more complex, dark, or unpleasant emotional subject matter than the meme style uploads. Vaporwave style uploads can involve the listener being asked to imagine themselves alone or abandoned in dilapidated spaces, while meme style uploads usually involve relationships, parties, usually focusing on adolescent lifestyles and markers. So you might have the action of crying in a bathroom at a party or something like that. In the interests of saving time, I'm not going to go into any more detail about the meme style uploads, but I'm going to turn to vaporwave style instead. So I've talked a little bit more about vaporwave in my upcoming article, but let's do a little quick summary of the genre. So it reinterprets popular media with a heavily ironic edge. I'm going to have a look at that. Musically speaking, the genre presents sounds filtered through the bass empty sheen of early digital instrumentation and synthesized sounds. Again, we see a lot of 1970s, 1980s, 1990s samples. Lynn has said that the popularity of Vaporwave was aided in large part by anachronous, post-ironic imagery of early digital culture, dead symbols of globalization and tokenized artifacts. This cover art we're going to see a lot of. Glitzos has pointed out that much of the Vaporwave style comes from this release. Countless memes, tributes, and homages to the Vaporwave aesthetic borrowed directly from this album cover. A Roman bust, a pink neon background featuring a city skyline at dusk, and Japanese language characters. Chandler has suggested that the most common Vaporwave imagery includes... But I think there's actually one that Chandler has missed, other than these. I think that a fairly obvious one is the use of a color palette based on pink and purple. In our Filterwave uploads, which again I think we should think of as a spin-off from Vaporwave, we tend to have several show up a lot. Shopping malls, usually empty, obsolete, dilapidated, obsolete tech as well, 1970s, 1980s, or 1990s samples, and a pink and purple color palette. We also tend to have a theme of isolation. The image on the right here, actually, no, not on the right, on the bottom, highlights the dead mall aesthetic of Filterwave, the abandonment, the loneliness. This next slide shows some cover art. Again, we're seeing those pinks and those purples. Each of these also references outdated technology. So the strong focus of these Filterwave uploads on malls also then provides links with a further Vaporwave subgenre, Mallsoft, which presents the act of shopping in a mall or buying items as pleasurable in and of itself. Mallsoft albums are usually constructed so as to form a virtual soundscape of visiting a mall, which is a very weird genre, I am well aware. Mallsoft again depicts malls as idyllic, untouched locations. This perfect 1980s and 1990s. Notice as well the bottom right of the one on the right. The old school Windows start menu. Again, we're seeing those references to things that we're familiar with from the past. In contrast, Filterwave tends to focus on similar themes, but a much more dilapidated form. So Winston and Saywood have noted that Filterwave's method of slowing down or pitch shifting familiar songs and emphasizing glitches and audio effects evokes uncanniness, as well as a strong feeling of isolation or alienation. Within the nostalgia genre continuum, all of these related genres, this acknowledgement of these feelings of alienation and isolation could be considered a form of self-soothing. In both Vaporwave and these Filterwave uploads, listeners are able to use the shared nostalgia and the created isolation of this music to engage with others and their own feelings, both through the use of the YouTube comment section, but also simply through engagement with the upload itself. While these uploads do tend to suggest scenarios that are unlikely or impossible to occur, listeners nonetheless collectively construct the nostalgia of this music as a form of self-soothing, then personalizing their nostalgia for it to the point of complete unreality. This sense of lost nostalgia or angst in these is a thread that really runs quite consistently through Filterwave uploads. The title of several uploads implicitly asks users to recall events in their childhood or to otherwise engage with events from their past. These then act as a beacon for users to engage with their feelings and to use the upload as a cathartic way of self-soothing. For example, the upload Hey There Delilah, but it's played in an empty Toys R Us at 2:37 p.m. with moderate traffic outside, which I think, no, not that one, acts as a tribute or homage to the toy store Toys R Us. The upload was first posted to YouTube one day after the chain shut down all of their locations after bankruptcy. For users, YouTube users growing up during the 1980s, 1990s, or even the 2000s, the closures of the stores would serve as a reminder of mortality, aging, and the loss of childhood. Note also that the song Hey There Delilah is from the mid-2000s. Listeners mention feelings of sadness and reflect on their childhoods. These comments also highlight the collective form of nostalgia inherent to these uploads. I've previously written in regards to chillwave, synthwave, and vaporwave that by engaging with the imagery of this style, users construct a collective memory. And I concluded that In this collaborative memory, it's not the real 1980s or 1990s for which listeners are nostalgic, but the plainly fictional form found only in the listener's imagination, often taking inspiration from popular culture. Here, a similar sharing and engagement with nostalgic feelings is occurring, and even users without any first-hand experience of the memory are nostalgic for an event which they may have never experienced. Similar themes can be found in these users' reaction to other filter wave uploads. Users frequently highlight the nostalgia that they're experiencing, whether based on the user's own memory or simply reconstructed through popular culture generated by the upload. And comments often make reference either to a fictionalized image of the 1970s, 1980s, or 1990s, or to the user's own experience with the time period. I think some quite weird comments there. Van der Herven has argued that one of the driving forces in audiences engaging with popular culture and music in particular is the desire to explore popular music history and to use that as cultural tools to relate your own autobiographical experiences to accounts of the past. Listeners are then able to formulate their own partially fictionalized version of times that they have no personal experience with, can never have a personal experience with, or which they've had maybe only fleeting experiences. As in other larger genres on the nostalgia genre continuum, in Filterwave, these listeners use the repeating visual and musical themes as a form of escapism, both through their own imagination and these online comments. Although the nostalgia that's such a major and fundamental part of this music on the nostalgia genre continuum is generated by imagery that the user never experienced or experienced maybe only tangentially, the soothing and comforting feelings that this engenders are nonetheless wholly legitimate for the listener. Like other music on the nostalgia genre continuum, Filterwave offers the listener escapism. While the feelings generated might not always be the most comforting, they allow the listener to engage with any feelings of loss, sadness, or loneliness in a safe space through the reassurance of a familiar song that they might have heard many times before. Equally, the presence of other users commenting on these uploads, often creating vivid microfictions, allow the listener to engage and acknowledge with their feelings and to accept that their feelings are shared and to engage with these emotions in a comforting way. Thank you. Any questions?
I think after you started talking, a little play button came up on the first.
Oh, did it? Oh, do you want me to try again?
Do you want to try again?
Yeah, sure.
Just took a while to.
Hey.
Try clicking what's on YouTube.
Let's give it a try. No, it's not working. I mean, if you want to imagine it, the easiest way to imagine this genre is to very simply imagine exactly what it says on the tin. There are no surprises. Once you've clicked on the link, you know exactly what you're getting, which I suspect is part of the reassurance of these. When I click on this, I know that I'm going to hear Toto Africa re-equalized to sound like it's playing in an empty shopping center. There is nothing changes. It's well worth having a listen to these. The YouTube comments, as I mentioned, are quite fascinating, quite eye-opening. And there are a lot of these. This user alone has several hundred of these. It's a little skewed because he also uploads these, will customize these for you for a fee, which doesn't really help.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I was like,
I found it.
okay, can we hear it?
Just Google Toto Africa shopping mall, it comes up.
Yeah, So the user that has uploaded a lot of these. There's many users that upload these, but he will upload whatever song you want, re-equalized to sound if it's playing in a bathroom, in a school, from outside a house, outside a club, outside wherever. Again, the equalizations are fairly similar for the most part. Just cut the bass and you've done half the work, really. But that sort of skews things a little bit because the most popular ones do align with these ideas very much so. The big hits of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s are really well represented, getting 3, 4, 5, 6 million views. But he'll also pick whatever song you want to do the same thing to, which does skew things a little, but the view counts do not lie. They will keep things on track. Any other questions at all? Yeah.
Is the capacity for shared popular culture experiences diminishing over time? Because they're using a lot of stuff from the 70s, 80s, and 90s when media was more centralized or more monopolized by big conglomerate companies. And, there's so much about popular culture that, and it's not just that I'm getting older. My kids, sometimes I find out stuff about really recent popular culture my kids haven't found out about yet. Or they may never, because it's getting so diffused on this.
Yeah, that is something that comes. Do you want me to repeat the question as well? So the question was, Liam's question was about whether, as we age and as times change, whether the sources of popular culture are going to change, whether we'll stop seeing the 70s and the 80s being referenced. That's the kind of the gist of it.
It's becoming way more fragmented.
Yeah, how popular culture is becoming more and more fragmented. I suppose what becomes really interesting is that you get this very American-centric, very, I guess, internet-based sort of. If you imagine what the internet imagines as the 1970s or the 1980s, that's what these tend to really represent. It has very little to do with what the real 1970s, 1980s, 1990s looked like. But if you, the comments tend to, say, for example, there's one that I saw the other day that was ABBA playing in a abandoned food court. And the comments were all to do with various cliched 1970s cop shows. So as references to things like Starsky and Hutch, which is pretty outdated. But if you think 1970s cliches, stock standard America-centric ideas of what the 70s look like, that fits quite nicely. So I think we tend to see, because that's fairly firmly locked in as like, oh yes, the 1970s, ABBA, bell-bottoms, disco, there's a fairly stock standard set of imagery. We're going to see that repeated again and again and again, and could be in 50 years' time we'd still see the same kind of thing. There's very little space in this genre for realism in any sense. So, yeah.
That rings true, though, doesn't it? With the internet, I mean, it's pretty much an echo chamber for confirmation bias.
Exactly right. I think this is...
the other thing that interests me, I mean, Liam said, something about in the past when things were more centralised. But I mean, all this is funneled through YouTube, which is in one sense, a conglomerate, the ultimate monopoly of popular culture. And it sort of also, then you've got to link that into advertising.
That's right.
And so what drives all this activity, it's all down to this sort of coalescence around a shared aesthetic and a sort
That's
of
right.
reinforcement of bias, and that's tied into highly supercharged advertising strategies based on AI. So I mean, I sort of see it all in that context.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it from
Advertising on this?
in terms of it's like sponsored ads and things. Not more so than any other YouTube video, I don't think. Not more so than any other.
But not less?
I wouldn't think so. But I mean, I'm getting a ton of ads on YouTube at the moment, so I can't say it's more, but I haven't noticed any less. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I hadn't actually considered the advertising angle. I'll have to give that some thought. But I think, yeah, I will continue to ponder that. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think we better wrap it up.
Okay, that's fine. No worries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you to those of you who've joined us online for the first part of the live stream. We're going to have a morning tea break now, and we'll come back for the second half of this morning's live stream session at 11:30 with a performance by the Viney-Grinberg Duo. That's on your second link on the website, so we'll see you then. Thank you very much.